It's on?
Yeah.
Okay. So everyone knows about the movie Godzilla, right? It's the fire-breathing lizard that is often confused with your mother in this case. In many action blockbusters of the same title, made in Japan and the US, but the focus of my speech will be on the original Godzilla that was made in Japan in 1954. And I have never seen the 2014 reincarnation.
That's a good thing.
This isn't working?
No.
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I have to unzoom.
Yes, unfortunately.
So, I'll only talk about the original monster and its resonance in the Cold War era. So that's from the end of the Second World War to basically the early 1970s. But yeah, I'm really talking about the first two movies, not the whole Cold War. The first Godzilla was in Japan, and it was called Gojira. It contained many elements of post-Hiroshima and Nagasaki anti-nuclear sentiment. So that's basically what my speech is going to be about. And this is the title, the cover for the first Godzilla. Gojira, Gojira. That's how it reads. In the first Godzilla film, Godzilla, you could say that it's a creature that is awakened by nuclear testing, because there is nuclear testing right at the beginning of the movie. And this is in a time in Japan when the incident of the Lucky Dragon fishing boat was still fresh in the minds of many, and I'll talk about that later. Oh, okay, I need to unzoom that.
It was much more into this.
Oh, it's going back to the pictures library.
Fine.
Sorry. So, I'll just zoom in on that. That is the Lucky Dragon fishing vessel. It was caught in the blast zone of the nuclear testing, and several people on that ship got really sick from radiation poisoning. One of them died, but I'll go more into that later on. Also, I'm talking about the fact that Godzilla is kind of like an allegory for a nuclear attack. So in the movie, Godzilla scorches Tokyo with its fire breath, which is also called atomic breath by a lot of people. And that is somewhat similar to the initial blast effects of the nuclear bomb. There is the characteristic flash, or in Godzilla's case, a bright light from his mouth. I did it again.
Okay. Alright.
I just zoomed it in too much. How do I get it back?
Top tab.
Okay.
Did you look at switching pictures using the arrow keys as opposed to the screen?
You need to be at the original zoom.
Yes. And that's the last. Out breath. Also, the Godzilla of the first movie was very similar to a nuclear bomb in the way that to combat it was to invent an equally dangerous weapon. One of the characters in the film, a scientist called Daisuke Serizawa, invented this device called the oxygen destroyer. It sounds really intimidating, right? I think there's a picture of it. I just need to... How do I know it's zoomed in enough?
I don't know. I don't normally.
Okay.
Should be on the side.
That is the oxygen destroyer. This device theoretically could remove oxygen from all living flesh and as a result magically dissolve the flesh. I guess those of you who know science know that the actual results of oxygen deprivation in living flesh is not as drastic as that. But perhaps it's a reflection of scientific education in Japan in the 30s and 40s more than anything. And a topic for another discussion, perhaps. Maybe. It's a pretty simple concept. So, those are the actual effects of hypoxia with reduced oxygen. It can result in death, but it doesn't like sort of disintegrate the flesh. Interestingly, Serizawa's willingness to sacrifice his own life to ensure that humans couldn't use the oxygen destroyer reflects on the gravity of the weapon being used. Nuclear bombs usually triggered a problem that was too big for humanity to face, one that had to be faced using something just as bad. So, in the Cold War, there was the concept of mutually assured destruction, where the Soviet Union were constantly developing bigger bombs, and then there was the arms race with the US developing even stronger bombs, and the oxygen destroyer is kind of like matching the destructive fire or the destructive power of Godzilla. But the interesting thing about Serizawa is that in Godzilla he decides to get rid of the oxygen destroyer rather than let it become something like the nuclear bomb. So that kind of reflects anti-bomb attitude, an attitude that they didn't want to develop something that was as bad as the nuclear bomb or anything like the nuclear bomb. The script and narrative of Gojira is also an allegory of the nuclear attack. But there are also technical aspects such as music, camera angle, costume and set which are effective in portraying the nuclear attack. So we'll also look at characterization and two contrasting attitudes reflected in the film's two two scientists, Sarazawa and Yamane. I'll also explain the issue of whether or not there was an underlying message of anti-Americanism in the theme of nuclear weapons. So in this picture, on the far right is Sarazawa, and next to him is Yamane. And that's the, I think that's Hiroshima after it was bombed. Okay, so I'll also explain the issue of whether, in 1945, Japan became the only country to have nuclear weapons used against it. One in Hiroshima and the other in Nagasaki. It's actually debatable whether or not the nuclear bombs themselves caused Japan to surrender to the US. After all, the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were comparable to the destruction of other cities by conventional means, namely Tokyo, which was firebombed without mercy. And to give you an illustration of how badly it was firebombed, this was a woman carrying her child on her back, and she was burned to death in that attack against Tokyo. So that really illustrates how bad it was, and it wasn't a nuclear weapon; it was a conventional weapon. Conventional weapons. Also, according to a free online lecture that I did it again. I'll just continue. According to a free online lecture that I listened to recently from Harvard, that person explained that the Japanese surrender did not come as a result of the nuclear bomb attack against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It actually came just after the Soviet Union's declaration of war. The Japanese were going to fight to the last man, to quote a moderate Japanese person, but the threat of being hounded by two superpowers was simply too much for the Japanese elite to consider continuing the fight. And nuclear bombs was a good excuse at the time to surrender. Yeah, so that's just a picture of the map of the Cold War, and obviously Japan didn't want to be attacked by Russia, so it just surrendered to the Yanks. And said, oh, we surrendered because they bombed us and it was so horrible, and bombs just make everyone want to run and hide. Well, they do, but there were other conventional attacks against Japan that were just as bad as the bombs. Nevertheless, the long-term effects of the bomb did seem to have a profound effect on ordinary Japanese people and their families and their everyday lives. like this wreckage, but more long-term effects, such as Japan committing for such a long time to not have nuclear weapons in an offensive capacity. So a few years later, after the war, there was an incident that is quite relevant to Godzilla, because that the director drew that idea from that incident to think of the beginning for Godzilla, where they had the nuclear tests, and bad came as a result of it. So in that test, the bomb's yield was much higher than expected. So as a result, the bomb's radius blew out of proportion, and the Lucky Dragon got caught inside the radius of the effects of the explosion. So they weren't destroyed by the explosion, but they saw the explosion, and they had lots of fallout cover their boat, and this fallout, in fact, was what caused the death of one of the fishermen on that boat, called Kubiyama, and that's his family grieving. It was quite an incident in Japan. And that's Kubiyama himself. So, Ishiro Honda, the director of Gojira, was looking for a profitable film idea, and was reminded of the Lucky Dragon incident when he flew to the South Pacific to do a different film. Then he came back to Japan, and Godzilla was born. So I'll go a little bit into why he decided to make a movie like this. It was because, like a lot of Japanese, he had been affected personally by the nuclear attacks. Like when he passed through Hiroshima at the end of the war, he felt like the war was ending. I'm not sure if it was because it was the only city he passed through, but obviously the fact that Hiroshima was bombed with the nuclear attack had an influence on him. And he was right to believe that the idea of transferring this feeling of the world ending to the realm of science fiction, because when Godzilla was released in cinemas, people were crying as they left. So he was on the money there. Also, another reason why a movie like this would be made in Japan and why it becomes so popular is that Japan was in a precarious geographical position between two nuclear powers, and there was the real possibility that if they caught got caught on the wrong side of the Soviet capitalist nuclear arms race, they could suffer what they suffered in World War II. As I said, I mean, that may or may not have been a thing that influenced a lot of Japanese people, but the fact that a movie was made about a monster that is attacking a city in the style of a nuclear weapon, and that actually became popular, must mean that there was some kind of anti-nuclear feeling. And there was, because in 1949, the Prime Minister Sato made a very famous speech where he outlined 4 pillars of anti-proliferation, which have basically been the dogma for Japan's policy towards nuclear weapons ever since. Basically, they don't want to, they're not having any of it. So in the film, the first comparison of nuclear weapons that they show is that when they're investigating this incident involving a fishing vessel, and they have Geiger counters which register the presence of strontium-90. The plot of Godzilla also seems to be a combination of events that would occur in a nuclear disaster. There are after this initial event, there are people, all these families of the victims asking for answers, and even though there isn't any catastrophe yet, it's like there's a foreshadowing for a catastrophe or a potential catastrophe. And just after they're talking about this in this way, there's an attack on Tokyo by Godzilla and the city's destroyed. There's a funny story connected to this as well. The director, producer, and main technician went up to the top of the tall building in Tokyo, and they were just having a chat about how Tokyo could be destroyed, just casually. And the security guards for the building were like, "Are these terrorists planning an attack somehow?" So that they asked them to leave. And the next thing in the next event in Godzilla that is reminiscent of a nuclear attack is that yes, there's this old man on the island where the nuclear near where the nuclear testing occurs and where they first see Godzilla. And this is Godzilla attacking the island. There's this old man who says that there's an old superstition about a monster called Gojira, and he says that it feeds on humankind to survive. And to me, this is like a nuclear bomb. Because they're used by one nation in order to force another to agree with its terms, and in this negotiation, human life is used as a bargaining chip. Without human life, there would be no need for nuclear weapons.
Give us
Stewart.
a sec.
Before Tokyo is destroyed, one of its helicopters is also destroyed in the remote South Pacific island where Godzilla first emerges. And just like in real life, where the first people to suffer from the from nuclear tests are minor, it's just another foreshadowing thing, which I'm all about when it comes to movies, clearly. In one of the scenes before Godzilla's attack, and people are preparing for the attack, people on the train are talking about what would happen if Godzilla were to emerge out of Tokyo Bay. One man says, the shelters again? That sucks. And this is reminiscent of what would happen in a nuclear attack. People would be having to go to the shelters, and this is actually what happened in the Cold War. School children were taught the duck and cover method when they were at school, and taught where to go when there was a nuclear attack coming. These were usually bomb shelters. A monster like Godzilla coming is like more or less the same thing as a nuclear attack coming. And also, when Godzilla does actually attack, wait, no, let's do it. Sorry. The plan to kill Godzilla when it arrives in Tokyo shows how futile any attempts to defend against Godzilla are. And this is very reminiscent of nuclear attacks as well, because they try and put up these huge electric fences around Tokyo to make sure that Godzilla doesn't get in. They're basically these huge electric fences and towers. I'll try and find the picture. It's not actually in order. Yeah. This is Godzilla actually tearing through the electric fences that are supposed to be defending Tokyo. But the fences are nothing to Godzilla, and they would be nothing to a nuclear attack. There are also many evacuation scenes in Godzilla, in which people are literally carrying their livelihoods on their backs, or the backs of those little wagons they're dragging along. Every time there's news of Godzilla approaching Tokyo, or it reaches Tokyo, there are people fleeing the city, but there's no escape. Just like in the situation of a nuclear attack. The city's just too condensed and too vulnerable to fire and burning, falling buildings and falling trains when Godzilla picks them up. And the fragility of cities in an attack like this is shown in the set of Godzilla. It was actually a really amazing set built by this guy called Subaraya, who was a he designed models and costumes and stuff. He created a scale model version of Tokyo so that a person in a Godzilla suit could be seen stomping around in Tokyo. And be seen destroying buildings with his atomic breath and twisting metal towers and crushing cars as though they're made of cardboard, and they're actually made of cardboard. And the metal towers are actually made of wax. What they did is that they put really strong studio lights onto the set until the lights literally melted the wax, and you'd see Godzilla just bending the towers out of shape. I've actually got a picture of that. Oh.
Why couldn't you use my laptop?
Didn't have the required port.
Yes, it does.
No.
I've used it like 14 times before.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought.
Yeah, so this is what they did to make it look like Godzilla was bending all the metal things out of shape. That's actually made of wax. Also, there was the angle of the camera. So they had the camera shooting from a very low angle, so everything looked much bigger, and it looked like it was actually happening. Even though, like, nowadays we're spoiled for graphics, and it just looks like a model set. But back then it would have been pretty impressive. Even now, when you watch a scene where there's a train car full of passengers speeding towards Godzilla, and what you see is just a toy car being picked up and thrown by Godzilla. In between those shots of the toy train, there's also shots of the people inside the train, so you have a sense of like what's happening, and it's not comical. It happened again. And also the costume. The Godzilla costume was actually designed to be symbolic of the nuclear bomb. Initially, as they originally envisaged it, Godzilla was just a monster that emerged as the result of a nuclear bomb, and covered with scars from the bomb, which Gojira was. Just this giant lizard thing covered in scars. And the prototype was actually this large octopus-like creature. It's got the shape of a bomb, right? But it ended up being a costume that could be worn by a person, because this was more affordable and more practical than other options. It's kind of hard to get a person walking around in an octopus suit.
Octodad, anyone?
Oh god, that game is difficult.
So, Honda also had the idea for making Godzilla breathe have an atomic breath. And as I said, it's very similar to the initial blast effects of a nuclear bomb. Sound and music also show a connection to the theme of nuclear disaster and bombs. there are always big thudding sounds that accompany Godzilla. According to Honda, the director, the sound of Godzilla was meant to be like the sound of dropping bombs. And the sound of his roar was meant to be like the air raid sirens that accompanied that were a precursor to them. And one can always tell in the movie, in all the original Godzilla movies, that when Godzilla's coming, that thudding can be heard. And it's particularly scary when at the end of the movie they're going to destroy Godzilla with the oxygen destroyer, and you usually hear him when he's underwater, but in this case you don't. And also, additionally, but people talk about the idea of Godzilla being a sort of hidden theme of imposition by America, but I kid you not, writing a scholarly essay on popular culture isn't easy, and the kind of sources that I got this idea from were not scholarly. It's possible that since America was one of the first countries to develop nuclear weapons, that underneath the anti-nuclear message is an anti-American message. It was the Americans who were doing the nuclear testing in the Pacific and had attacked Japan with nuclear weapons. In Godzilla, there were no Americans helping the Japanese military. All the flags are Japanese. So you can't see any American flags there. And at the same time, there was an agreement with America to help Japan whenever it was being attacked. That was the Mutual Security Act. But even though that was something that was happening when the movie was released, there was no reference to it in the movie. So one could actually sort of try and take from that the idea that it was kind of an anti-American message, that if Japan gets attacked, the US won't actually help out. But yeah. Also, I mean, at that time, it would have made more sense for all the flags of the military defending against Godzilla to be American rather than Japanese, because Japan didn't really have any military left at that time. It was pretty much all of its infrastructure was flattened by American bombs. But don't quote me on that. Yeah, that's an argument a lot of people have. But Honda didn't actually have an anti-US message. He wanted to focus on how horrible war is and how horrible nuclear weapons are. Because he had experiences of being a soldier in China. And he had that experience of going through Hiroshima and being horrified. There's also a sense of Japanese military bravado. So it's kind of like we don't like war, but we're wanting to have a good defensive capability, have an army that will defend our people, and it's in the movie. It's Japanese military defending Tokyo against Godzilla. It's not Japanese military trying to attack any other countries. Also, when Serizawa and Ogata are about to use the oxygen destroyer on Godzilla, they are wearing the same Hachimaki headbands as the kamikaze pilots of the war. They're not actually committing suicide. It's only Serizawa that does that because he feels so guilty about making this oxygen destroyer that he wants to destroy the technology and just get rid of any possibility that it will ever be used again. But that also plays to the kind of Japanese feeling of wanting to sacrifice themselves for the good of their own country. And also, at that time, with the Japan was trying to assure the U.S. that it would not build up its offensive military capability, that it would just be a defensive army. So, yeah. Now onto the contrasting characters of Himane and Serizawa. They're both scientists. They both have a they approach nuclear weapons from different perspectives. For instance, when Himane is watching the news footage of Godzilla with his daughter Emiko, he becomes upset and explains that as a zoologist he does not want Godzilla dead. He's frustrated over the crisis that's being dealt with by firing the monster and infuriating it, rather than finding some way of making use of this monster as a zoological sample. And he also tries to convince the military not to shine lights on Godzilla because it'll make it angry. He appears to be more worried about scientific discovery with his own field than preserving human life. Whereas Serizawa is also curious about the scientific implications of Godzilla. He wants to study the radiological data concerning Godzilla so that he can find out how the monster survived that nuclear test in the first place. But after having invented the oxygen destroyer, which is just as bad as a nuclear bomb, he decides to he decides that human life is more important than just going ahead with this technology of the oxygen destroyer for the sake of learning more about this technology. So, what's the upshot of this anti-nuclear narrative? Instead of wanting to buy into the nuclear game, Japan put itself above the use of nuclear weapons altogether, and in 1949 its Prime Minister Sato postulated 3 golden rules of Japan's non-proliferation or use of nuclear weapons. As I explained before. Ironically, my current project is an attempt at convincing the Japanese in a policy report that they should convince the Americans to station gravity bombs on their territory as a extension of the nuclear extended nuclear assurance. But that may not be a good idea because I haven't really thought it out enough. And also the amount of outrage from the Japanese public at something like that happening would be enough for our Japanese policymakers to not even think about doing something like that. And that's because of movies like Godzilla that reminded the Japanese of how bad nuclear weapons were. Because they did actually compare nuclear weapons. They were talking about nuclear weapons early on in the film when things were sort of heating up, and people were asking, is the emergence of this strange creature, were nuclear bombs the cause of that? Basically saying that nuclear bombs, that only bad can come of them. The only way you can combat a nuclear bomb is by coming up with something that's just as bad, and the only way you can deter a nuclear bomb is using another nuclear bomb. So it all comes down to just trying to find an excuse to use this extremely destructive weapon against some region with a large population in it, in order to bargain with another country in strategic terms in a Cold War like the one between